In the last video on this snapper trimmer, we had trouble getting it to start even when using a drill to try and start it. Now, while diagnosing the engine, we found that it had more than enough compression for it to run. We also tested the ignition system and found out that it was also working as well. So today we're going to try to see if we can finally get it started. If you didn't see the previous video, there should be a link at the top of the screen that'll get you updated to this point. In today's video, we look at the snapper trimmer, and the problem is that it's very hard to start and it doesn't run all that great when it does run. In the last video, we were able to confirm that the engine has everything it needs to start and run, so hopefully once we go through the carb, we should be able to get it started and running the way it's supposed to. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. After confirming that we have spark and compression, the next step is to move on to the fuel system. Now, I think the reason we're having a problem getting it started is because the carb is putting too much fuel into the engine. When an engine is flooded with too much fuel, there's not enough oxygen for the combustion process to work properly. Now, I'll deal with that situation later on. Right now, I want to take the carb off and inspect it because that might explain why the engine is flooded. Before I take the carb apart, I want to show you the fuel adjustment screws. Now, these will help you fine-tune the fuel delivery. That way your engine can perform at different speeds. Now, the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for adjusting fuel at lower engine speeds, like when it's idling. Now, the screw closer to the choke flap is the H screw, and it's for adjusting fuel delivery at full throttle. Now, to make these adjustments, you might need a special driver, and on this particular one, I'm going to need one called a single D, but yours might be different. If you need one of these, they sell them as kits online and come with several different types. If you want to know more about them, there should be a link in the description. I also want to see where each one of the screws is set at. What I'm going to do is turn them clockwise until they stop and count how many turns it takes. Once I know what it is, I'll then turn them back to where I found them. So it turns out the L screw is 3 turns out, which I hate to say is quite a lot. I'm not sure if that's the default factory setting, but it's nice to know. That way we can put it back the way we found it. Using the same method, it turns out the H screw is only 1 turn out. Now that we know what the settings are, we can take the carb apart. Now, normally I would take the pump side of the carb apart first, but I'm very curious to know just how bad the metering diaphragm is. Now, its job is to control the fuel flow through the carb, and if it's in bad shape, it could cause the carb to deliver too much fuel to the engine, flooding it and making it hard to start. As you can see, the diaphragm is in really rough shape. It's not moving the way it's supposed to, which is going to cause some issues. To get a better look at it, we need to remove it from the metal plate and also the gasket around it. Now, once free, I can see that it's not very flexible at all. In fact, it feels somewhat stiff. It should move like a piece of cotton fabric, but as you can see, it's not doing that at all. Also, when buying a replacement diaphragm, make sure the stem in the middle matches the one you're replacing. The stems can be either long or short, and this one happens to be the longer one. The next thing I want to do is remove the bulb side of the carb so we can inspect the pumping diaphragm and the inlet screen for any clogs. So here's the pumping diaphragm, and on this type of material, these very rarely have any issues, but we still want to check and make sure that these 2 check valve flaps are not damaged, which ours are not, so we can reuse this one. If yours is damaged, then I would consider buying a replacement carb instead of a rebuild kit because it's just easier. So this is the inlet screen, and what we're looking for is that it's not covered in debris. This one isn't bad, although there is some on it, but when we do a flow test, it should take care of it. The first thing I want to do is to check to make sure that fuel will flow through the screen. To do that, I'm going to put some fuel in the pocket for the screen, and then press the rocker arm on the other side and see if the fuel will disappear through it. As you can see, the fuel disappeared through the screen, which means the screen is not clogged and we can start to put the carb back together. If yours isn't disappearing, you'll need to either remove the screen to clean it, or you can leave the screen there while you clean it, but you need to remove the needle and rocker arm on the other side first. While I'm here, I'm also going to replace the purge bulb. Now, the other one was not broken, but this will be a good time to replace it since I don't know how old it is. Now, the replacement bulbs can be either large or small, and this one happens to be the larger one. So here's the new metering diaphragm, and as you can see, it's a lot more flexible than the other one we took out. Now, if you wanted to avoid this part of the repair, I would just order a brand new carb instead. Now, I do get comments about how to find the correct rebuild kit, and to be honest, I have a tough time trying to find them myself, so that's the reason why I tell people not to rebuild it and just get a new carb instead. So I noticed this bit of electrical tape on the fuel line, and it looks like they were trying to use it to stop a fuel leak. Now instead of leaving it like this, I'm going to replace the fuel lines since we're redoing the rest of the fuel system anyway. And this is when we see the extent of the damage to the fuel tank they were trying to fix. So it looks like they replaced the fuel lines recently, but for some reason they either damaged the opening or tried to make it larger. Now this is not an ideal situation, and to be honest, the fix for this would be to enlarge the opening to the next size, but what I'm going to do instead is to use the next size fuel line, which I think is easier. Now the first line I'm going to run will be the fuel filter line, but it's up to you which opening you choose to make the filter line or the return line. Now when making the filter line, make sure there's enough line in the tank that it can reach the other end. This will make sure the engine doesn't starve of fuel when you have the trimmer turn on its side while edging. When installing the return line, I like to leave at least an inch of line in the tank. This will help keep the line from falling out later on. Now some manufacturers will install a plastic splice on this line while others won't. After the lines are installed, I'll cut the lines to a rough location to connect to the carb. Now before we try and start the engine, I want to test the fuel flow through the lines and the carb, so connecting the lines where they need to go is very important. The fuel filter line will connect to the brass port further away from the purge bulb, and of course that means the return line will connect to the port closer to the bulb. The mixed fuel I'm using is a full synthetic 2-stroke oil and 89 octane gasoline that contains no ethanol. If you can't find 100% gasoline in your area, try using an additive for ethanol gasoline. So when pressing the purge bulb, fuel will come up from the tank through the filter line and into the carb. It will then partially fill the bulb and then leave the carb through the return line and back to the tank. As you can see, fuel is flowing through the system just like it's supposed to. Now, if it's not flowing through the lines like they're supposed to, there could be an issue with the carb, or if the fuel is flowing in the wrong direction, try swapping the lines on the carb. If the fuel doesn't at least make it to the carb, there's a very slim chance that the engine will even start. Once I know the carb is getting fuel, I can start to put the trimmer back together. For those of you who didn't see the previous video, I took the rear cover off for access to the spark plug wire and the muffler. I then took off the recoil, which exposed the electric start option. Now instead of using the electric starter, I'm just going to use the pull starter instead. Since I think the engine is still flooded, I'm not going to use the choke. Luckily, it started and ran. Unfortunately, it didn't stay running. Before I try and adjust the carb, I'm going to try to increase the idle speed first, and then once the carb is adjusted, I'll then turn it back down. So this time we were able to get it to stay running, and it looks like we're having a problem with the throttle cable, but it turns out that was my fault. The trigger was in contact with the table, and that was affecting the idle speed. Just to make sure, I'm going to move the trimmer over the opening in the table and try that again. As you can see, the idle is now perfect and the throttle response is pretty good considering the load on the engine with that massive trimmer head on it. Now, I was happy with how the engine was idling and revving when squeezing the trigger, but I wasn't happy with how the engine was running while the trigger was squeezed. That means I was only going to adjust the H screw. The first thing I did was to turn the screw in different directions, trying to find when the engine speed was the highest. Once I found it, I then turned the screw a little bit more counterclockwise. This will not only drop the engine speed, but will keep the engine from getting too hot and destroying the piston rings. So in the end, this trimmer was basically suffering from a badly damaged metering diaphragm, which would cause the engine to flood and run poorly, which I hate to say would cause me to throw it away too, but after servicing the carb and of course clearing the flood of fuel from the engine, it's now starting and running a lot better. Another reason why this engine wouldn't start would of course be a spark issue. If that was the case, I would check the on-off switch for any issues, and if that was okay, I would then consider the ignition coil to be the issue. So my question is, would you want to have this type of trimmer head on your trimmer? I hate to say it, but my answer would be no. This style seems to be for clearing heavy brush and not a regular kept suburban lawn. Now there is a place for this type of head, but it doesn't belong in my yard. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.